A weathered cardboard box arrived at the Atlanta Museum of American History on a Tuesday morning in October 2023. Inside, tucked among faded letters and a torn Bible, lay a sepia-toned photograph that would change everything. Dr. James Carter, the museum's chief curator, carefully removed the portrait from its protective wrapping, his gloved hands trembling slightly as he recognized both its age and exceptional condition. The portrait revealed, the image captured 5 individuals arranged in a formal studio setting. A tall man stood in the back, his hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a seated woman. 3 children flanked them, 2 boys and a girl, their expressions solemn and dignified. All wore their finest clothing, starched collars, pressed dresses, and polished shoes. The backdrop featured painted columns and draped fabric, typical of photography studios in the late 19th century. James studied the photograph under his desk's magnifying lamp. The details were remarkably preserved. Every fold in the fabric, every strand of hair, every proud expression captured with striking clarity. But something caught his attention. He leaned closer, adjusting the lamp's angle to eliminate the glare. The woman's hands rested in her lap, positioned carefully over her dark dress. At first glance, they appeared naturally placed, relaxed and dignified. But as James examined them more closely, his breath caught in his throat. The discovery, the fingers weren't simply resting. They were deliberately arranged in a specific pattern. The index and middle fingers of her right hand crossed over her left palm, while her thumb extended at a precise angle. James had spent 15 years studying African-American history, particularly the period of Reconstruction. He had examined thousands of photographs from this era and documented countless family portraits and formal images. Never had he seen hand positioning quite like this. It was too intentional, too careful to be accidental. He reached for the documentation that had accompanied the photograph. A handwritten note on yellow paper read, "Thompson family, Atlanta, Georgia, 1892. Donated by Eleanor Thompson Harris, great-great-granddaughter." There was an address and phone number dated just 3 weeks earlier. James photographed the image with his high-resolution camera, zooming in on the woman's hands. He uploaded the file to his computer and enhanced the contrast, sharpening every detail. The pattern became even more apparent. This was deliberate communication. A message frozen in time for over a century. His colleague Patricia knocked on his open door. "You find something interesting?" James didn't look up from the screen. "I think I just found something impossible," he whispered. "Look at her hands." "Patricia, really look at them." Patricia stepped closer, squinting at the monitor. Her eyes widened. "Is that what I think it is?" "I don't know yet," James replied, his mind already racing through possibilities. "But I'm going to find out." The investigation begins. James spent the rest of the day cross-referencing the hand gesture against every database he could access. He consulted Victorian-era etiquette manuals, photographic posing guides from the 1890s, and academic papers on body language and historical portraits. Nothing matched. The positioning was unique, deliberate, and seemingly without precedent in conventional photography. By evening, frustration had settled into his shoulders like a physical weight. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. The autumn sun had long since set, leaving his office illuminated only by the desk lamp and the glow of his computer screen. Outside his window, the sounds of Atlanta's evening traffic hummed in the distance. He picked up his phone and dialed the number Eleanor Thompson Harris had provided. The phone rang 4 times before a warm elderly voice answered. "Hello, Miss Thompson Harris. This is Dr. James Carter from the Atlanta Museum of African-American History. I'm calling about the photograph you donated." "Oh yes, I've been hoping to hear from you." Did you receive everything safely? We did. Thank you. The photograph is in remarkable condition. James paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm calling because I noticed something unusual in the portrait. Your ancestor, the woman seated in the center. Her hands are positioned in a very specific way. Do you know anything about that? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. James could hear the faint sound of breathing, then what might have been a soft intake of breath. My grandmother used to tell me stories. Eleanor finally said, her voice quieter now. About Martha. About what she did before the photograph was taken. James sat up straighter, his heart beginning to race. What kind of stories? Stories she made me promise never to repeat outside the family. Stories about secret work, dangerous work. My grandmother said Martha saved lives, that she risked everything. Eleanor's voice wavered with emotion. She said, Martha was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, even after most people thought it had ended. Is that what you're asking about? James felt the air leave his lungs. The Underground Railroad, of course. The hand gesture suddenly took on new meaning, new weight. Miss Thompson-Harris, I need to know everything your grandmother told you, every detail you can remember. Can you come to my house tomorrow? Eleanor asked. I have things to show you. Letters. A diary. Things I've kept hidden for decades because I didn't know who to trust with them. I'll be there first thing in the morning, James promised, already reaching for his notebook. Eleanor's story. Eleanor Thompson-Harris lived in a modest brick house in the historic West End neighborhood of Atlanta. When James arrived the next morning, she greeted him at the door with a gentle smile and led him into a living room filled with family photographs spanning generations. The morning light filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the hardwood floor. I'm 87 years old, Eleanor began, settling into her favorite armchair. My grandmother Ruth was Martha's youngest daughter. The little girl on the right side of that photograph. She pointed to a framed copy of the same image hanging on her wall. Ruth lived until 1974. I was 38 when she passed, old enough to understand what she was telling me. James sat on the edge of the sofa, his recorder placed carefully on the coffee table between them. What did she tell you about Martha? Eleanor's eyes grew distant, as if looking back through the decades. Ruth said her mother was the bravest woman who ever lived. Martha was born into slavery in 1851 in South Carolina. When she was 14, she escaped with the help of conductors on the Underground Railroad. They brought her to Philadelphia, where she found work as a seamstress. But she didn't stay in Philadelphia. No. Ruth said her mother couldn't rest, knowing others were still suffering. By 1869, Martha had joined the network herself. She traveled back south, risking recapture to help others escape. She did this for years, Dr. Carter. Even after the Civil War ended, even after emancipation. There were still people trapped in forms of bondage. Sharecropping arrangements that were slavery in everything but name. Convict leasing systems, debt peonage. James listened intently, his mind processing the implications. And the photograph was taken in 1892, 27 years after the war ended. Exactly. By then, Martha had married Thomas, the man in the photograph. They had settled in Atlanta, started a family, built a respectable life. But Ruth said her mother never forgot what she'd done. Never forgot the people she'd helped save. The photograph was taken at a studio on Peachtree Street, a formal portrait to mark their 10th wedding anniversary. Eleanor paused, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Ruth said her mother insisted on that exact hand position. She wouldn't explain why, just said it was important. Did Ruth understand what it meant? Eleanor shook her head slowly. She was only 7 years old when the photograph was taken. She remembered the day. The new dress, the stern photographer telling them not to move. Her mother's unusual insistence about her hands. But Ruth didn't understand until many years later, when she was a grown woman and Martha finally told her the truth. James leaned forward. What truth? That the hand gesture was a signal. A code used by the Underground Railroad. It meant safe passage. Martha wanted it preserved forever. Wanted some record of what she'd done. Even if only she and a few others would ever understand it. The archives armed with Eleanor's revelations. James returned to the museum with renewed purpose. He immediately contacted the Library of Congress, the National Archives, and several universities with extensive collections on the Underground Railroad. If Martha's hand signal was indeed authentic code from the network, there had to be documentation somewhere. He started with the Smithsonian's collection of slave narratives and conductor accounts. For 3 days, he read through digitized documents, searching for any mention of hand signals or visual codes. Most references focused on quilts, songs, and verbal passwords. Hand gestures were mentioned occasionally, but never with specific descriptions, matching what he'd seen in the photograph. On the 4th day, Patricia entered his office carrying a worn leather journal. This just arrived from Howard University. It's on loan from their special collections. The archivist there said it might be relevant. James opened the journal carefully. The pages were brittle with age, covered in flowing handwriting, dated 1871. The author identified himself only as William, conductor, Philadelphia Station. James began reading, his eyes scanning quickly through entries about safe houses, routes, and close calls with slave catchers. Then on page 47, he found it. William had written, "Met with Martha from Carolina today. She returned south again despite my warnings. Showed me the signal she uses. Fingers crossed, thumb extended. Says it identifies her to those who need help. Lets them know she's safe. I worry for her, but her courage cannot be questioned." James's hands trembled as he photographed the page. This was confirmation. Martha was real. Her work was documented. And the hand signal in the photograph was exactly what Eleanor had said it was. But he needed more. He needed to understand the full scope of what Martha had accomplished. He spent the next week diving deeper into archives. He discovered church records from Atlanta's First African Baptist Church, showing the Thompson family as members. He found census records documenting their address and occupations. Thomas worked as a carpenter. Martha was listed as a seamstress, just as Eleanor had said. But the most significant discovery came from the Georgia Historical Society. In a collection of letters donated decades earlier by a white abolitionist family, James found correspondence between a woman named Martha and a Quaker activist in Philadelphia named Elizabeth. The letters, written between 1870 and 1891, were carefully worded but unmistakable in their meaning. In one letter from 1873, Martha wrote, "I have helped 3 more friends find their way to better circumstances this month." The journey grows more dangerous as vigilance increases, but the cause remains just. Another from 1878. Thomas worries for our safety, but he understands why this work must continue. The children are too young to know, but someday they will understand their mother's purpose. James photographed every letter, every document. He was building a case, constructing a narrative from fragments scattered across a century. Martha Thompson was not just a woman in a photograph. She was a hero whose story had been lost to history, preserved only in coded gestures and whispered family legends. Finding more descendants, James knew he needed to find more of Martha's descendants. Eleanor had given him names, her cousins, their children, anyone who might have inherited family stories or documents. He created a family tree, using census records and genealogical databases to trace Martha's bloodline forward through 5 generations. His search led him to Chicago, where Martha's great-grandson Robert worked as a high school history teacher. James called him on a cold November afternoon, explaining his research and the photograph. Robert was silent for a long moment before speaking. "I've heard whispers about this my whole life," Robert said quietly. "My father used to say we came from strong people, brave people, but he never gave details. Said some stories were too dangerous to tell, even now. Would you be willing to meet with me, share what you know?" 2 days later, James flew to Chicago. Robert met him at a coffee shop near his school. A tall man in his 50s with Martha's same determined eyes. He carried a manila envelope worn at the edges. "This belonged to my father," Robert explained, sliding the envelope across the table. "He made me promise to keep it safe, to pass it down. I've never shown it to anyone outside the family." Inside was a small leather-bound book, no larger than James's palm. The cover was cracked and faded, but the pages inside were filled with neat handwriting. It was a record book, listing names, dates, and locations. At the top of the first page, in slightly larger letters, "Lives saved through God's grace and dangerous work. Martha Thompson, 1869-1892. James's breath caught. "Is this what I think it is?" "It's her record," Robert confirmed. "Every person she helped, every journey she made. My father said she kept it hidden her entire life, that she gave it to her daughter Ruth on her deathbed in 1918. It's been passed down mother to daughter, father to son ever since. We've protected it because we knew someday someone would need to tell her story properly." James turned the pages with trembling hands, name after name, dozens of them. Beside each, a date, a route, a destination. Some entries included notes: family of 5, youngest child only 2 months old, journey took 3 weeks, arrived safely in Cincinnati. Another, former blacksmith escaped Virginia. Skilled tradesman found work in Philadelphia. The last entry was dated September 1892, just 1 month before the family photograph was taken. Final journey. Age and caution dictate retirement from this work. 73 souls guided to freedom over 23 years. May God forgive what I could not do and bless what I accomplished. 73 people. James whispered. She saved 73 people. Robert nodded, his eyes glistening. And no one knew. She lived and died as a seamstress, a mother, a church member, a respectable woman in a respectable family. But she was so much more. Building the case back in Atlanta, James assembled a team. He brought in Patricia, 2 graduate students specializing in African-American history, and a code breaker from Georgia Tech who had experience analyzing historical encryption systems. They gathered in the museum's research room. The photograph projected large on the wall. "We know what the hand signal meant to Martha," James explained. "But I want to understand if it was part of a larger system. Were there other signals, other codes used by the network?" The code breaker, a young woman named Lisa, studied the image intensely. "Hand signals were practical for the Underground Railroad," she said. "They could be used in situations where speaking was dangerous. In crowded markets, on street corners, anywhere slave catchers might be watching. A conductor could identify themselves without saying a word." One of the graduate students, Michael, pulled up his research on a laptop. "I found references to other gestures in conductor narratives. A hand placed over the heart meant safe house nearby. Fingers touching the brim of a hat meant danger. Do not approach." These signals varied by region, by network. Each group of conductors had their own system. So Martha's crossed finger signal might have been specific to her network. James mused. A Philadelphia to Georgia route perhaps. Over the next several days, they mapped out possible routes based on Martha's record book and historical knowledge of the Underground Railroad. They identified safe houses, known conductors, and documented escape routes. Martha's journeys had followed a pattern in South to rural Georgia and South Carolina, gathering people trapped in exploitative labor systems, then north through Atlanta, Chattanooga, and Louisville, finally to Philadelphia or other northern cities. Patricia discovered something crucial in a collection of wanted posters from the 1870s. One issued by a Georgia plantation owner described a Negro woman approximately 30 years of age, skilled with needle and thread, known to move among plantations offering sewing services, suspected of inciting workers to abandon their contracts. Reward offered for information. That's her, James said immediately. Martha used her skills as a seamstress as cover. She traveled to plantations and farms, ostensibly to do sewing work, but really to make contact with people who wanted to escape. The hand signal would have been how she identified herself to those who'd heard about her through the network. Lisa nodded thoughtfully. It's brilliant, actually. A black woman traveling alone would draw suspicion unless she had a legitimate trade. Seamstresses were in demand, especially in rural areas where skilled workers were scarce. She could move relatively freely, make contact, assess situations, and plan escapes without raising immediate alarm. The team worked to verify each entry in Martha's record book. Using genealogical databases, census records, and city directories, they traced the fates of many of the people she'd helped. A blacksmith who'd settled in Philadelphia and opened his own shop. A family who'd made it to Canada and established a farm. A young woman who'd become a teacher in Boston. Each life represented not just a rescue, but a legacy. Children, grandchildren. Entire family trees that existed because Martha had risked everything. The photographer's secret. As James delved deeper into the photograph itself, he decided to investigate the studio where it had been taken. Eleanor had mentioned it was on Peachtree Street in Atlanta. Using city directories from 1892, he identified 3 photography studios operating on that street at the time. The most prominent was owned by a man named Frederick Harrison, a white photographer who'd established his business in 1887. James found an article in the Atlanta Constitution from 1893 announcing Harrison's sudden departure from the city. No explanation was given. The studio had simply closed, and Harrison had vanished from public record. Intrigued, James tracked Harrison's history backward. He'd come to Atlanta from Philadelphia in 1886. Philadelphia, the same city where Martha had lived and worked with the Underground Railroad network. The connection seemed too specific to be coincidental. James contacted the Philadelphia Historical Society and requested any information on Frederick Harrison. What he received 2 weeks later made everything click into place. Harrison had been a member of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. His photography studio in Philadelphia, which he'd operated from 1878 to 1886, had been listed in abolitionist networks as a safe location, a place where escaped slaves could receive assistance. He was part of the network. Harrison knew Martha from Philadelphia, James explained to Patricia. When he moved to Atlanta, he may have continued supporting the cause in secret. And when Martha came to him for this family portrait, I knew exactly what she was doing with her hands. Patricia finished. He would have recognized the signal immediately. James found more evidence in Harrison's business records preserved at the Atlanta History Center. In 1892, the year the Thompson photograph was taken, Harrison had photographed dozens of African American families, far more than his white competitors. His prices were lower for black clients, and according to handwritten notes in his ledgers, he often waived fees entirely for families in difficult circumstances. One entry stood out: Thompson family portrait, October 1892, no charge. An honor to document such dignity and grace. Below it, in smaller writing, "May her courage never be forgotten, though only a few of us will ever know." Harrison had understood. He'd recognized Martha's signal and preserved it with meticulous care. The photograph wasn't just a family portrait. It was a collaboration between two members of a secret network. A final documentation of a hero's quiet defiance. James discovered that Harrison had died in 1910 in Pennsylvania, having returned to Philadelphia after leaving Atlanta. His obituary mentioned his photography work, but nothing about his abolitionist activities. Like Martha, he'd kept his secrets, carrying them to his grave. But unlike Martha, he'd left behind no record book, no descendants to preserve his story. Only the photographs remained, silent witnesses to his role in the network. The grave Eleanor provided James with Martha's death certificate and burial information. She died in 1918 at age 67 during the influenza pandemic that swept through Atlanta. She was buried in the historic Oakland Cemetery in a section reserved for African American families. James visited the grave on a gray December morning. The headstone was simple: Martha Thompson, 1851–1918, beloved wife and mother. Nothing about her courage, nothing about the 73 lives she'd saved. Just a quiet marker for a woman the world had forgotten. But Eleanor had given him something else. Ruth's diary, written in the 1920s, years after Martha's death. In it, Ruth recorded everything her mother had told her in those final weeks of life. When the pandemic was taking its toll and Martha knew her time was ending. James read the entries in his office. The winter rain pattering against his window. Ruth's handwriting was shaky in places, emotional. "Mother told me today about the night she helped a family with 6 children cross the river outside Louisville. The youngest fell in. Mother jumped in after him. Nearly drowned herself, but she got him to the other side. She never told anyone that story until today. She has hundreds like it stored in her heart, carried in silence all these years." Another entry. She said the hardest part wasn't the danger. It was coming home afterward, sitting at the dinner table with us, pretending to be just a seamstress, just a mother. She said she felt like 2 different people. The respectable Martha everyone saw, and the conductor Martha, who only existed in darkness and secret moments. She said she never regretted it. But the weight of those secrets grew heavier every year. In the final entry, written just days before Martha's death, Ruth recorded her mother's last words about her work. "I did what I could with what I had. I was one woman with a needle and thread, and I used it to stitch together a path to freedom for those who needed it." When they take that photograph out years from now, when people look at my hands, I hope someone will understand what they meant. I hope someone will know we resisted, even when resistance seemed impossible. That's all I ask, to be remembered, not for what I appeared to be, but for what I truly was. James set down the diary, his vision blurred with tears. Martha had known. She'd known the photograph would survive, that her gesture would outlast her. She'd trusted that someday someone would notice, and 131 years later, here he was, noticing, understanding, preparing to tell the world. The exhibition. James spent 3 months preparing the exhibition. It would be the centerpiece of the museum's new permanent collection on African American resistance and resilience. He worked with designers to create a space that honored Martha's story while educating visitors about the broader context of the Underground Railroad and post-Civil War activism. The photograph would hang in the center, enlarged and dramatically lit. Surrounding it would be the evidence he'd gathered. Pages from Martha's record book, letters, Harrison's ledger entries, Ruth's diary excerpts. Interactive displays would explain the hand signal code system, show maps of escape routes, and tell the stories of the 73 people Martha had saved. James tracked down as many of Martha's descendants as he could find. Beyond Eleanor and Robert, he located 12 others scattered across the country: teachers, engineers, artists, retirees. He invited them all to Atlanta for the exhibition's opening in March 2024. The week before the opening, James gave a lecture at Emory University about his research. The auditorium was packed with students, professors, and community members. He told Martha's story from beginning to end, showing slides of the photograph, the documents, the evidence that proved her extraordinary life. During the question period, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Dr. Carter, you've proven that Martha Thompson was a hero. But how many other people like her existed? How many other heroes are hiding in old photographs, waiting to be discovered?" James smiled, though the question carried a bittersweet weight. That's exactly the point. Martha was exceptional, but she probably wasn't unique. The Underground Railroad and other resistance networks depended on ordinary people doing extraordinary things in secret. Most of them left no records. They couldn't. It was too dangerous. So their stories died with them. Martha was lucky. She kept a record. She had descendants who preserved it. And she left us that photograph with its coded message. But for every Martha we discover, there are probably dozens we'll never know about. Opening day, the exhibition opened on a Saturday morning. More than 300 people attended, including all of Martha's descendants James had located. Eleanor, now using a walker, but still sharp and graceful, cut the ribbon alongside Robert. News cameras recorded the moment. Local and national media had picked up the story. The photograph, the hand signal, the incredible revelation of Martha's secret life. James watched as visitors moved through the space, reading the labels, examining the documents. Standing in front of Martha's photograph, he saw children pointing at her hands, asking their parents what the gesture meant. He saw elderly visitors weeping quietly. He saw scholars taking notes, already planning their own research projects. In the months following the exhibition's opening, Martha's story spread far beyond Atlanta. Academic papers were written about her and the network she'd worked within. Documentary filmmakers approached James about creating a full-length film. Schools began incorporating her story into their curriculum on the Underground Railroad and Reconstruction-era resistance. But the most meaningful response came from the descendants themselves. In June 2024, they organized a family reunion in Atlanta, the first time many of them had met. Over 100 people gathered, all connected by blood to Martha Thompson, all alive because she'd been brave enough to risk everything. James was invited to attend. He stood at the back of the church hall where the reunion was held, watching as Eleanor addressed the crowd. At 88, she spoke with clarity and passion about the grandmother she'd never met, but had spent her life honoring. Martha Thompson was a seamstress, Eleanor said, but she didn't just sew fabric. She stitched together hope and freedom. She threaded courage through her life and the lives of 73 others. And because of her, all of us are here today. Her descendants, yes, but also the descendants of those she saved. We are her legacy. Every life in this room, every child, every dream, every achievement, they all exist because one woman refused to accept injustice and did something about it. After the speeches, Robert approached James. "On behalf of the family, we want to thank you. You gave us back our ancestor. You made sure her sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten." James shook his head. "Martha did that herself. I just noticed what she wanted us to see." The legacy continues. The photograph remained on display at the museum, drawing thousands of visitors each month. People came from across the country to see it, to stand before Martha's image and understand the courage represented in her carefully positioned hands. The gesture that had once been a secret code was now a public symbol of resistance, ingenuity, and hope. James continued his research, investigating other photographs from the era, looking for similar signals and hidden messages. He discovered 3 more possible examples: hand positions, clothing choices, objects held in specific ways that might have carried meaning beyond what appeared on the surface. Each one opened new avenues of inquiry, new potential stories waiting to be uncovered. One evening, as he was preparing to leave the museum, a young visitor approached him. She was perhaps 10 years old, clutching a notebook. "Dr. Carter, I saw the exhibition about Martha Thompson. I'm doing a school project about her." "That's wonderful," James replied. "What did you learn?" The girl looked up at him with serious eyes. "I learned that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And I learned that even when nobody's watching, even when nobody knows, doing the right thing still matters. Because someday someone might notice. Someone might tell your story." James felt emotion tighten his throat. "That's exactly right. What else did you learn?" "I learned to look closer," the girl said. "At old photographs, at history, at everything. Because important things are sometimes hidden. And if we don't look close enough, we might miss them." The closing reflection. As James walked to his car that evening, the Atlanta skyline glowing in the dusk, he thought about Martha Thompson. He imagined her in that photography studio in 1892, carefully positioning her hands while her husband and children watched, trusting that her message would survive. She'd been right to trust. Her secret had waited 131 years, but it had endured. The photograph was no longer just a family portrait. It was a testament to hidden courage, a reminder that history is full of untold stories, and a challenge to anyone willing to look closer, to notice the details others might miss. Martha Thompson had saved 73 lives through dangerous, silent work. And now, more than a century later, her hands still spoke across time, teaching new generations about bravery, resistance, and the power of one person to change the world, even if that change remains invisible for over 100 years.